I had a friend called John Rathall, who was the film editor of City Limits magazine's film section. I was writing music with him because I used to be in bands, and I nagged him to let me do a film review, because when I was a musician, what I spent the rest of my time doing was watching movies. At the Scala in particular and other repertory houses, I was quite knowledgeable by that point. He thought he'd put me off by sending me to very obscure Japanese films at the NFT. He sent me to one that involved, all I can remember about it is it involved a lot of industrial chimneys. But unfortunately, he didn't put me off, because I ran into a guy called John Harkness, now deceased, who was then the BFI's expert on Japanese cinema, who told me a whole load of stuff which made my review kind of easy to do. And so John then commissioned me some more. And then there was a kind of rupture at City Limits, which was very complicated. There were two editors. It split into two factions. And for a bizarre reason, my friend John hired me in to do the film listings, almost as a kind of help to me, but a revenge on the other faction. I arrived the day the computer arrived, the very first computer arrived. I learned how to do the film listings very quickly. About 3 weeks later, John's faction were kicked out of the magazine, and they would have kicked me out as well, had it not been for the fact that I was the only person who knew how to do the film listings on the computer. So that's the kind of lucky break you need, in a way, to find yourself inside film criticism. I was actually listing where all the films were on in which cinemas, exactly as you find these days in online or in Time Out magazines and so on.
But with a brief.
But there was also a film review section, which I took over. Well, in fact, Jonathan Romney took it over, but I was working with him on that film section. And we both applied for the vacant job. They gave it to Jonathan. He had come from the music section, and I thought I was out. But in fact, City Limits liked my interview so much they gave me the television section to run. So I went from being not a journalist at all to running the television section in about 3 months.
Okay.
I don't think there are any popular misconceptions about what we do. I think we're regarded as the villains of the piece. I spend a lot of my time with people who make films, and by and large, if you're at a dinner table full of people, I mean, obviously some of them are my friends now, but when they weren't my friends, you're tolerated. You're not, you're the person at the table that they'd rather wasn't at the table most of the time. Because, the critic is the bad guy. In an ideal world, these geniuses would just continue to make fabulous work, and the public would just tell them how much they love them. And that's the perfect circle. But, the best people in the business, the best actors, the best directors, understand and appreciate what good critics can do. And many of them acknowledge that a good piece of criticism can actually change their approach to things. And when I say many, maybe, many's a bit strong, but some appreciate it. That's the really interesting bargain, the one between film distributors and critics. And if you talk about us being part of the marketing process, I think increasingly more and more film criticism is part of the marketing process. I regard some rival magazines of Sight and Sounds as pure promotion and nothing else. I'm not going to name them, but that's effectively they're just an element of the marketing machine. We're not, but at the same time, I don't seek out, and neither does our reviews editor seek out negative reviews. Sometimes they just come in because you've sent somebody who gets very angry with what they've seen. Even then, I prefer negative criticism to be sort of positive negative, in other words, constructive criticism to, some kind of knee-jerk emotional reaction. But this is a kind of art form that we are very passionate about, otherwise we wouldn't be spending our time, especially now that there is no such thing as a career in film criticism almost. We wouldn't be doing it if we were not passionate about the subject. Advocacy is, of course, the prime goal of the cinephile element in film critics. Not all film critics, I think, are cinephiles. I think some of them are too cynical to be cinephiles. But by and large, most of them are. I think film criticism these days, given the huge multiplicity of voices, is actually more useful almost after the event, after you've seen the film. That's when film criticism comes into play for me. You read something that enhances what you've seen, rather than sort of Friday night tipsterism. I'll go and see this tonight because you'll have a great time. That seems to me, except for about 5 or 6 names in the UK, it's a dead game. Peter Bradshaw, yes, he's a very important person. If you're a small film, you need Peter Bradshaw to give you a good review. Almost nobody else is significant in that way. And that's an interesting industrial position. If you're an English language reader, and you can read at the click of a button the New York Times or Hollywood Reporter or any of those people who we always view with starry eyes as a kind of closer to the action, if you like, closer to the big industry, and therefore have a more clearer sense of how movies work. Why would you want to read, what some internet hack thinks about Spectre? Advocacy for the unknown film becomes a kind of way that you can distinguish yourself if you're somebody that's not well known for writing about film. So consequently, everybody is striving to do that. So it's one of the reasons why there is no longer any critical consensus of a great mass kind, except for a few really big headline titles. Once you get to the smaller films, thousands of different film writers are advocating thousands of different films. It's something that we at Sight and Sound, when we do our annual poll, see as a problem that grows with each passing year. That we get vastly more titles, and our contributors are mostly professionals. So if they're doing it, it's even worse among the people who are writing for free. The way I look at this, I'm not sure it's completely accurate or not, but it seems to me that there is roughly the same proportion of people that love what we might call art house or alternative or independent or specialist, any of these words, cinema, as there was in its heyday in the 60s or 70s. But in the 60s and 70s, those people would get 2 new films a week if they were lucky. Now they've got 20 new films a week, and that audience is being spread that thinly across 20 new films a week. So nothing seems like a success, and nobody can build a career. So the ball game has changed. Of course, you can't reverse history. This isn't a kind of old man sentimentality. It's just a live issue. How do we deal with the fact that we have way too many films being released? And I'm sure many other people sitting in this chair have said the same thing. I think film writers become entangled in the smaller circles of consumption that arise out of an internet economy, in the sense that, on a really tiny level, people make films on YouTube and it's watched by their friends. But to some extent, what we're involved in with the smaller films is we're talking to a tiny community with the film writers. They know the film writers who speak to them, and they go and see the films that speak to them. But it's actually a much smaller circle of production and consumption than it used to be. And maybe it's not such a bad thing to have lots and lots of these circles of consumption. It certainly works for the music business to a certain extent. Nobody makes the ridiculous money they used to make, but maybe that's not altogether a bad thing. But where film's an expensive medium, and you kind of want to have talents coming through who get to use the full train set, the full Orson Welles train set. And I fear that it's much harder for really distinctive new talent to get through to that train set. During the course of Cannes, what we do is we have a rolling blog, so different people come on and may do a sort of 2 or 3 paragraph review of a new film. And I will do 2 of those during the course of Cannes, which isn't a hugely onerous burden. But I am old enough to remember when we didn't have to do anything at all in terms of writing in Cannes until we got home, which was more productive in some ways in terms of the culture of criticism, because there was far more leisure time for critics in between films and in the evening when you're eating a meal to talk about the films, and debates were far more kind of lively, more entangled. Rows, there were great rows. I remember a fantastic rows around Lars von Trier's Dancer in the Dark, where the late Philip French was spitting with fury, and a young Wendy Ide was standing up for it. And you just don't get that kind of thing anymore, because everybody disappears to write as fast as possible. I think Sight and Sound and myself, we both prefer the considered opinion that a film should be thought about for a couple of days before you write about it. We prefer that, but the market demands a more instantaneous response. And indeed, there are writers who write even better with an instantaneous response than they do after a couple of days. I would suggest that my good friend Jonathan Romney is even more of a genius when he writes in Cannes for the Screen Daily, straight off the cuff, than he is sometimes for The Observer when he's thought about it for a couple of days. But, over time, I've moved away from the good, bad, yin-yang thing of criticism. It bores me. I'm no longer interested. It's great. It's bad. I'm only interested in what's interesting about this film. That's what I want to know. And that's what Sight and Sound wants to know, is, what is it in this film that's worth talking about? And that's why I think the Friday night tipsterism thing is dead, as far as I'm concerned, because it's just about green light, 4 stars, 5 stars, whatever, which, I have no interest in reading much, except when it's entertaining, And interesting thing to introduce to the subject of criticism, if you're writing for a major newspaper, you have to be entertaining. And Peter Bradshaw came from a comedy column, and he's brilliant at actually combining criticism and humour. There's not a lot of laughs in Sight and Sound, but entertainment is part of the game, and so you need to be able to write in such a way that you're engaging the reader. Well, star ratings, interestingly, in the history of my magazine, there was a part of the magazine that was a separate magazine once upon a time called the Monthly Film Bulletin, and on the back of the Monthly Film Bulletin, what we did is we asked all the major critics in the UK and some in the United States what their star ratings of that week's releases were, or months, I should say, months' releases were, and so we were doing it 40 years ago, but we don't do it in Sight and Sound because there's an absurdity to me between comparing a 4-star rom-com with a 4-star documentary about Syria. What's the comparator? They've got nothing to do with each other. But star systems, also it's a terrible fact about star systems that nobody reads a 3-star review. So you're almost, if you put 3 stars on it, you're saying don't read this.
And 3 stars are often where all the interesting stuff is happening.
Yes, yes. I would say that in Sight and Sound, the person who would be most inclined to a star system would be me, and I'm very against it. The others would be even more against it than myself. That's how passionate a crew I have, working with me. None of them would compass a star system for a nanosecond. I think there was a boom and now we're in a bust, but there was a bust before the boom. One of the things that the late Alexander Walker, the Evening Standard critic, used to say was you could get the entire British film commentary community in the back of a Mini in his day. And it was a game for a small number of people. What happened around the time that I came into film criticism was there was a huge boom in magazines. It was a massive boom in magazines in the 90s. Probably the most illustrious example was the success of FHM magazine, which kind of came out of nowhere and made everybody a fortune, But that was a time when magazines were suddenly the thing, and every single one of those magazines, it partly came off the back of The Face and The Enemy and all that kind of the success of those magazines and papers. All of those people wanted film content. So suddenly you went from a world where there was a tiny number to suddenly there was a huge number of people writing about film. And interestingly, it's now, 7 years ago now that the American newspaper critics all lost their jobs in a year. It's about 7 years ago. Film was the canary in the coal mine of journalism. the first people to go were the film critics, and then it just went through all of journalism. And so I think that was the end of a boom in publications, rather than, the internet's come, it's the end of something that was permanent. It wasn't permanent. It was a bubble, if you like. And in terms of professionals, we've moved back to a situation where the number of professionals is getting smaller. There are fewer people at some film festivals now, especially fewer Brits. If you go to Venice, there are far fewer people from Britain able to go to Venice and commentate on it. So it's gone back to what it was before, rather than, it's a complete disaster. The sad thing is that the tablet computer, which was going to be the saving grace of magazines, hasn't worked for anybody. We've migrated some subscriptions onto the tabloid-shaped computer, but not enough to make it a kind of, a big gang-busting. We particularly hoped it would penetrate the US market for us, and it hasn't, to be honest. But it may yet happen, because tablets are becoming more and more familiar. The problem was that they came up with a smaller tablet. That was partly to do with it, because the iPad size one is perfect for magazines. The smaller one is not great. You can't do the page turning on it very easily. But they were more successful, so. We're about to change our app, our app subscription model. I've not yet done the test of the new thing. I've had a look at it. It looks much better than the one we're using at the moment. I mean, you have to keep developing these things in order to try and get the most out of them.
Because the technology keeps changing.
The technology keeps changing. We need people to be able to read sight and sound on their phones like anybody else, and they can, but it needs to look better than it does currently. My major concern about international cinema in general is that the market for it is shrinking. And those of us that love it, it's not being passed down to younger generations in the same numbers. I mean, there are people who are into it, but they're smaller numbers than the people who are into it in their older generation. So it's a problem. I'm not sure about the future of serious film journals. I think ours will survive. I worry more, in fact, for the French ones, because I think they're in dire trouble in terms of circulation. And yes, but we hope, we wouldn't want to see Cahiers or Positive die, but they seem even more tied to the past than magazines in the UK do. That is the $64,000 question. Is a professional more competent? If you're talking about good, bad, thumbs up, thumbs down, 5 stars, 1 star, no, there's no difference at all, in my view. It's just, did I have an enjoyable experience? That's the root of that question, and anyone can answer that question. And it's really interesting that when they do those preview screenings for the public, or focus groups, is what I really mean. When they do focus groups, it's really interesting that people change their behaviour. They stop judging a film according to whether or not they've had a good time, and they start judging it as if they were a critic. It's a very interesting change in mindset. But where the professional wins out over the amateur is just simply that they have people looking at them, scrutinising what they do, making sure they're good enough. And for me, that means that their writing is likely to be better. It'll be edited. It'll be, other people advising them as to what's good and bad. And in general, they've got to achieve a really high standard to keep their job, and that's where there's an edge, if you like, and it's in analysis in particular that I think the professional is going to be slightly better. There are many different complex situations, and it is part of a critic's job occasionally to sit in the cinema with the people who've made the film, and if you know them and you don't like the film, you're desperate to try and reach the back exit, or you have a whole set of things that you say like congratulations, or you did it again, it's all up there, all these things you can say which avoid saying it's not very good, and of course any filmmaker watching this will want to kill me right now, and I don't blame them, because that's 2 years of their life, and I'm always very aware that you're watching something that is at least 2 years of somebody's life, and many people's lives are involved in it. Which is why, I'm slightly ashamed of that incident I talked about, because I think now about Chantal Akerman and the people who booed her film in Locarno, and the consequences of that. As critics, when we're watching a film, we should not be trying to control our emotions, because our emotions are part of the response. Of course, you need the difficult thing about being a critic is you're, and this is something that Roland Barthes writes brilliantly about. You're stuck to the screen in the film, but at the same time, you've got to take the backward step and think about its architecture, think about how it's working the whole time. So it's a kind of double action that you're involved in, and that's the difficulty. But it becomes second nature after a while. Film criticism, its history, which we haven't really discussed. It has a long and rich history involving lots of really, really brilliant writers. But in the main, I think it's been a dialogue between France and the United States. And I think that British film critics sit to one side, and we're the ones with the sense of humour. And we're the ones who slightly kind of think that, well, the French take it way too seriously, and the Americans get too involved in that seriousness, as well. And that, for me, comes from an old tradition of criticism which Terry Eagleton writes about, which is, the amateur gentleman. We haven't shaken off this thing. This, oh well, it's just cinema. Whereas we at Sight and Sound, we try, we take it deadly seriously, but I think it's important to remember to stick your tongue in your cheek every once in a while.